Hi, so a couple months ago, someone in the comments on my video in which I recite William Blake's poem, The Tiger, suggested that I create a video explaining the meaning behind this poem, one of the great classics of English poetry and of the Romantic period. That's the late 18th century through 19th century movement in the arts that celebrated emotion over reason. And this inspired me to write a piece on it, having recently submitted and had a piece published by the UK-based publication Flexible Philosophy. That's PH Flexible Philosophy. It's a wonderful journal, and I hope you'll look into it. It inspired me to write a piece based on their format. They have a 1,500-word limit, and based on a three-part essay structure. So I've now published 3 articles with them. My first was concerned with autism, the second with Donald Trump's trade war with China, and the third now is my piece on William Blake. So I'm going to be going over that as a way of both promoting my published work and also to fulfill my desire to respond to that request I received in the comment on my previous YouTube video. So, my piece is titled Tiger in the Garden, The Enduring Relevance of William Blake. The publication says, how did Romanticism push back against the Enlightenment? Are there any similarities between William Blake and Isaac Newton? That's a summary the publishers added to it. Those aren't my words, but here we go. Newton's third law of motion teaches that every action generates an equal and opposite reaction. Following the example of Sokal and Bricmont, those are physicists, I am leery of shoehorning the natural sciences into the liberal arts, but every student of history recognizes the vertigo of cyclicality. Every social and political movement spawns a counter-movement in some form. A side note on the reference there, you see, Jean Sokal and Alan Bricmont or Alan Sokal and Jean Bricmont, sorry, are these scientists who collaborated on a book in which called Fashionable Nonsense, Postmodern Intellectuals' Abuse of Science, in which they address the tendency of postmodern academics, people following the post-structuralist school of continental philosophy, to use the hard sciences in a way that isn't genuinely scientific as a way to promote their ideological agendas. So also very worth reading. And anyway, I had just finished reading that when I first started writing this piece, so that's why I was a bit preoccupied and determined not to make that same mistake. So, the legendary English poet and artist William Blake was no fan of Newton, which in itself is somewhat ironic. Blake is regarded as one of the giants of Romanticism, the artistic and literary revolution that rebelled against the 18th century Enlightenment, renouncing its rationalism to stress the importance of expressing authentic personal feelings. Romanticism valued the emotional over the rational, the awe of the sublime over the intellectual, subordinating humanity to the whirlwinds of the natural world and denying any capacity to rise above nature. Blake particularly despised Newtonianism for reducing the universe to a soulless mechanism. His popular color print of Newton is sometimes misinterpreted as a celebration of the thinker. It is not. Rather, it is a mockery or even a condemnation, an admonishment of lumbering rationality and misguided faith in scientific reason over what Blake believed were the more profound and liberating powers of the imagination, to quote a contemporary scholar. The irony is that Blake's vitriolic rejection of Newton can be regarded as the perfect analogy for Newton's third law. His obsession with the power of the imagination as a force of nature is palpable in Blake's most famous poem, The Tiger. Mixing Christian and pagan mythology, a mixture peculiar to Romanticism, Blake's mythical creation is worshipful without being reverent. Blake was iconoclastic in what he idolized, and his spirituality was never simple. He believed that to be humble, one must possess the capacity to sincerely denigrate oneself, and so Blake despised organized religion because it made a spectacle of false humility. He's far from alone in that. The literary critic Oliver Turle observes that the repeated question punctuating The Tiger presumably is rhetorical. The real question behind the question is why? Why indeed? The good Christian obeys God's will without question, but we all fall short sometimes. Yet Blake does not even pretend not to resent God's superiority. It has been observed of the Old Testament's Job that while the suffering hero finally acknowledges that Yahweh does nothing without good reason, he never withdraws the question concerning his punishment. Why? Likewise, Blake externalizes his own battle with the divine in the form of a question, marveling at the duality of a creator who sculpts tigers and lambs alike into being. Did he who made the lamb make thee? Also, by the by, it was my college English professor, Mark Lester, from Western Washington University, who described that scholarly analysis of Job to me that way once. The subject of my first class with him, the theme he brought to the class was the concept of escape and whether it's possible. And he cited that instance as a example of humanity resisting the will of fate, or the will of God, so to speak. Given his mystical rejection of Newton, we can only imagine what Blake would have made of Darwin if he had lived long enough to encounter him. Yet it would be misleading to equate Blake's mythos with the fundamentalism of modern creationists. In rejecting Orthodox Christian theology, Blake rejects the Godhead. The tiger is more enigmatic than most allegories. To the extent the divine appears at all in the poem, it is not theistic but panentheistic. Not God as benevolent father, but God as a generative, almost uncontrolled force in nature. There's a modern theory concerning the evolution of tigers that suggests they emerged in north-central China in the basal stage of the Pleistocene. During this period, all sorts of species were evolving into more impressive megafauna. Modern theory posits that Pleistocene tigers may have grown into their fearful symmetry as an adaptation to increases in the size of their preferred prey. Blake would surely find that plausible. Now, I'm going to take a detour through another Blake poem, The Garden of Love, which is also available on my YouTube channel in video form. I first encountered The Garden of Love through the Facebook page of the novelist Anne Rice. A committed religious dissident and general contrarian, Rice shared the poem in response to the news of a Vatican priest who resigned after coming out as gay, admitting to having a Spanish lover, and calling on the Catholic Church to modernize its stance on homosexuality. Like any college-aged Catholic, I found The Garden of Love electrifying from the first reading. What more articulate summation of the corrosive effects of religion on healthy sexuality could there be, and coming from a religious icon, no less? Perhaps, like most scholars, I've come to find it less electrifying over time, though, and I find it now more sobering, inspiring more introspection than catharsis. Gardens in poetry, Turle writes, tempt us to recall the Garden of Eden, the paradise that existed before the succumbing to temptation. The art historian Paul Johnson describes how Blake and his wife often danced about their London garden naked to work themselves into an Adam and Eve mood. Like that original morality tale, the deceptively simple poem becomes nuanced as it grows in the imagination. It is easy, too easy, to read The Garden of Love as an oversimplified polemic, a withering indictment of the sexual morality of the times. Well, this was a bit before the Victorian era. Blake was writing in the late 1700s. The 1700s English culture, so you can imagine how they felt about what we now call healthy sexuality. Why then the passivity of the narrator's tone, the glaring lack of anger or self-righteousness? There's no implication in the closing lines that Blake has any intention of, running around knocking the briars out of the priest's hands, binding with briars my joys and desires. He has come to the garden where he used to play on the green, gambling naked with his wife perhaps, and found the space profoundly altered, reduced to a graveyard, crowned by a chapel decrying the very spirit of the garden that existed there before, and thou shalt not writ over the door. Blake is rightly associated with the free love movement, but this is a broad concept, and his views evolved over the course of his own life. Turrell, paraphrasing D.G. Gillam, explains, if the garden is of the mind, and the chapel that despoils it is also of the mind, the corruption stems from the speaker's own mental attitude rather than an external reality. Repression comes from without, but can only be perpetuated by its impregnation within. Forces that shape our psyches in our formative years, these become part of ourselves, against which we can fight, but we can never entirely eradicate. Even victory is not eradication, for a mere opposite is nevertheless a reflection. What can we infer from this? Perhaps that the capacity to temper our creative energies, for better and for worse, is to be found in the garden of love, so to speak. Alicia Ostreicher has observed that Blake is not merely tearing down what he despises. He is also asserting that gratified desire does what religion pretends to do, gives access to vision, the discovery of the infinite. Transcendence, in other words, comes as much from within as repression. Unbounded passion is as destructive as the tiger. Unbounded intellect is the monstrous creator of the tiger. From both of these driving forces emerges the nostalgia for the garden. There, whether in joyful desire or binding briars, we have the time and the peace to reflect upon ourselves. Which brings us to the living Blake, the part of Blake that is still relevant today. Like a mirror, Blake shines so brightly today because his work channels the anxieties handed down by the post-Enlightenment era. The battles between science and faith, emotion and intellect, and ideology and humanity rage unabated still. If anything, the contests have only grown more vicious over time. In such an environment, thoughtful people seek parallels, and in William Blake, who is in many ways a precursor of Sigmund Freud, we find them. The tiger resonates perhaps more with the modern reader than with readers in Blake's own time, because humanity has never been more self-aware than it is now in the age of social media and worldwide communication, most of all of its own capacity for the creation of destructive powers, for our potential to destroy nature and ourselves. That staccato cacophony framing the tiger's fiery body in this poem, coming across as magma made flesh with burning eyes, it prophesies by a century and a half the rise of the atomic bomb, this omnipresent threat of nuclear annihilation that is still with us. And less directly, but even more ominously, it presages the environmental catastrophe of global warming, born out of the industrialization made possible by the Enlightenment that Blake despised. The power to play God with nature is balanced, as always, by a Newtonian corollary, the potential to be annihilated by that same power. This is what happens when we reach beyond our grasp. As happens so often with ideological opposites, Newton and Blake arrive via different routes at the same conclusion. Do we dare to hope for a solution? Blake would say, perhaps rightly, that nuclear weapons and climate change are proof of Romanticism's founding principle, that humanity is subordinate to nature, and we tangle with it at our peril. Nature, like the divine, perhaps equivalent to the divine, cannot be outwitted or superseded. Yet Blake, as we have seen, does not follow his own advice, recognizing that it is in his own human nature to question what he perceives. He places himself inside the mind of the tiger's creator and asks what purpose this creation serves. Perceiving in his God the duality that creates tigers and lambs, he perceives that potential in himself and in all of us. Out of his own conflicted internal life, he becomes a creator himself. There's a saying, someone, I think, I don't remember who off the top of my head, but I think, William Faulkner, I believe, said that the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. Like the Newtonian, he protests too much not to be. Blake intuits that the underlying determinism of the universe is, for all the perception of divine freedom and creativity that he insists is real and present in the universe, because he doesn't want to be bound by physical, material limits, as Newton's philosophy, as his laws of motion suggest we are. Blake nevertheless implies a determinism. He acknowledges the illusory nature of free will by taking this approach. But he is at least wise enough to caution against impulsive experimentation with these forces that are beyond human understanding. Because again, like Newton, he realizes that one way or another, whatever our relationship is to the universe is infinitely bigger and stronger than all of us, even humanity in the aggregate, and always will be. So, that's it for this episode. As always, feel free to check out my article and all the other articles available on Flexible Philosophy. It's a great site. It's a growing publication, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. I'm very grateful they gave me a chance. And there you can find a couple other pieces by myself, and also feel free to check out the rest of my videos on my site, and maybe there will be more to come in this vein. Thank you.